In the Western conception, the religion of Islam often begins and ends in the arid desert of the Middle East. Despite this, in the modern era, the nation with the single highest population of Muslims in the world is not Saudi Arabia, Syria, Iraq, or Egypt. Instead, the largest Islamic country on earth is a steaming land of tropical jungles, terraced rice fields, and blustering monsoon winds located over 7,500 miles away from the land of Islam's birth. Deep in the maritime heart of Southeast Asia, the island nation of Indonesia is home to over 279 million people, 86% of whom are Muslims. Islam is a religion that was famously spread by the sword, yet the armies of the caliphate that carried the faith from Spain to Pakistan never stepped foot on Indonesian soil. This begs the question, how did a tropical archipelago traditionally dominated by Hindu-Buddhist kings become the most populous Muslim majority nation on earth? To properly contextualize how Islam reigned supreme in Indonesia, we must first provide a brief survey of the religious history prior to its arrival. The modern country of Indonesia is part of a wider political geographical region known as the Nusantara archipelago, a massive chain of over 17,000 islands stretched out over 5,000 kilometers of ocean. Nusantara is home to over 300 unique people with their own culture and language, most of whom belong to the Austronesia ethno-linguistic group. The Austronesians were prehistoric humanity's greatest seafarers, arriving upon the tropical islands of Southeast Asia, abroad study caravanas and outriggered canoes over 3,500 years ago as part of a multi-millennia migration that began on Taiwan a millennium earlier and ended on islands Polynesia 2 millennia later. Throughout the Medieval era, the Austronesian people of Nusantara channeled the seafaring prowess of their ancestors to forge some of the most prosperous maritime merchant kingdoms in all of pre-colonial Asia. These kingdoms were largely concentrated on the islands of Sumatra and Java, which served as the gates to the most important shippings in the world, the Malacca Strait. Since ancient times, the Malacca Strait has been the central nexus of the maritime Silk Road, which connected the Celestial Empire of China to the ancient civilizations of India, Persia, Arabia, and beyond. By mastering the shipping lanes that connected numerous extremely wealthy empires across Asia, the rulers of Java and the Sumatra became extremely wealthy themselves. As the monsoon winds blew foreign traders onto Nusantara's shore, so too did they blow in foreign philosophies, science, political principles, and religions. While the Austronesians were originally an animist people, constant contact with the civilizations of India saw them slowly adopt Hinduism and Buddhism as their two main faiths. By the 8th century AD, the rulers of kingdoms like Mataram and Srivijaya had become fully Indianized, with their kings portraying themselves as avatars of Hindu gods like Vishnu and Shiva, and styling themselves as Devaraja, an ancient Sanskrit word meaning God King. Grand monuments were consecrated to glorify their divinely mandated reigns, such as Borobudur, which to this day remains the largest Buddhist structure in the world, and Prambanan, the second largest Hindu temple in Southeast Asia. If India was the place from which the kings of Nusantara received their spiritual legitimacy, then China was the place where they received their political legitimacy. It was an ancient custom that foreign kingdoms wishing to do commerce with China had to swear nominal fealty to the Chinese emperor, something that Nusantara's Hindu-Buddhist king played along with in order to gain access to Chinese riches. Throughout the medieval era, successful rulers in Sumatra and Java often underlined their entitlement to rule by demonstrating China's approval. The zenith of Nusantara's Hindu-Buddhist era was marked by the rise of the Majapites, a massive seafaring empire that emerged out of the chaos of the Mongol invasion of Java in the 14th century and united the vast majority of the archipelago under its rule. However, as the Majapahite rose in prominence, so too did an alternative religion that began growing exponentially in popularity, challenging the divine authority of the empire's Hindu god kings. This new faith came in form of melodious muezzin, proclaiming the call to prayer from the peaks of Nimeret. The origins of Islam lie a world away from tropical Nusantara in the arid sand of dunes of Arabia. Here, in the 7th century CE, a caravan merchant received a vision from God that would change the world forever. Within 2 generations, the successors of the Prophet Muhammad had stormed out of the Arabian Peninsula in one of the fastest and most successful conquest sprees in world history, forging a caliphate that spanned from Iberia in the west to the Indian Hindus in the east, as the Islamic Caliphate was now the dominant power of Middle Eurasia. It controlled the ports that made up of the western end of the maritime Silk Road. From those ports, Muslim merchants from Persia and Arabia set forth along the same route their ancestors had for centuries, blowing eastward along monsoon winds in search of silk, porcelain, and spice. As the wind of commerce carried these entrepreneurs further than the armies of the Caliphate had ever trade, it also pollinated their fate along the trade routes they followed, with communities of foreign Muslim merchants sprouting up in coastal areas throughout Southeast and East Asia, including Sumatra, Java, and even China. Indeed, by the time of China's Middle Tang dynasty in the 8th and 9th century AD, sizable Muslim communities had developed in the thriving port cities of the southern province of Guangzhou. As China had long exerted heavy political influence upon the kings of Sumatra, the Chinese Muslim community would later play a big role in introducing Islam to the region. By the 10th century AD, the economic influence that Muslim traders enjoyed on the maritime Silk Road had increased exponentially to the point where local rulers began converting to their religion. The first known ruler in Nusantara to embrace the faith of Mecca was an Achaemenid king in the late 13th century named Merensilu, who ruled over the enigmatic state known as the Samudera Persia Sultanate on the northern tip of Sumatra. Very little is known about this medieval ruler. However, his status as the first Muslim ruler in Nusantara is supported by a certain Italian adventurer named Marco Polo, who visited the northern Sumatran port city of Pelek in 1292. Among the many colorful anecdotes in his travelogue, which makes mention of cannibals in the hills and native men with monkey tails, Polo remarks that the locals of Pelek, who used to be Hindus, has recently converted to Islam. While the Samurai Persia Sultanate was probably the first Muslim state in Nusantara, it was far from the last. The tipping point when Islam began to outpace Hinduism and Buddhism as the dominant religion in the archipelago occurred in the early 15th century with the founding of the Sultanate of Malacca. In the year 1389, the mighty Majapahit Empire was entering its twilight years. Its greatest king, Hayam Wuruk, had passed away after a marathon 49-year reign, and in the wake of his death, many vassal rulers in Nusantara's outlying islands now sought to break free of their Javanese overlord. One of these rulers was Parameswara, the Hindu Raja of Singapura, the precursor to the modern city-state of Singapore. Upon Hayam Wuruk's death, Parameswara repudiated his vassalage to the Majapahit throne. In response, Majapahit forces invaded Parameswara's land and drove him from the city. Forced into exile, Parameswaras fled north to the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula. Here, according to traditional account, he converted to Muslim, took on the Persian name of Sri Iskandar Shah, and established the Sultanate of Malacca, a flanking state surrounded by larger, more established neighbors. The Sultanate of Malacca might have been snuffed out in the crib by its larger neighbors if not for the unlikely support it received from the Dragon Throne. At the turn of the 15th century, Emperor Yugla of Ming decided that the whole world needed to be reminded about how awesome China was. Traditionally, this was done by inviting dignitaries from outlying nations to the imperial capital, where they would pay tribute to the Son of Heaven and receive lavish gifts to bring back to their homeland in return. However, Emperor Yugla decided to be more proactive, commissioning the construction of a massive fleet that could travel to foreign lands and receive tribute directly. The result was one of the most impressive feats of naval engineering in world history, a flotilla of absolutely colossal treasure ships, aptly named by the priceless cargo of silk, porcelain, gold, and silver, were carried from the foreign rulers who paid tribute to the Great Ming. The Grand Admiral of the floating city was to be Emperor's favorite Encron, Zheng, who critically to our story was a member of China's Muslim community. Between 1405 and 1433, the Great Ming treasure fleet embarked upon 7 journeys across the sea, all of which passed through Java and the Malacca Strait. On the second journey in 1409, Zheng exchanged gifts with the Sultan of Malacca as a fellow Muslim. Zheng must have felt a kingship with Parameswara, extending his protection to the fledgling Sultanate. In 1411, Parameswara joined Zheng on his return journey to Beijing, where he visited Emperor Yong's court as a foreign dignitary. The Ming Emperor evidently liked what he saw in this Sumtran noble, elevating him to the position of legitimate hegemon of the entire Malay Peninsula and even supplying him with imperial soldiers to help defend his realm from neighboring kingdoms. Elevated by Ming China, the Malacca Sultanate went on to dominate the Malacca Strait for over a century, becoming the richest maritime empire in Southeast Asia, as well as the region's greatest center of Islamic learning. Malacca's rulers had a deep respect for their Sumatran origins and invested heavily in spreading Islam to Sumatra. It wasn't long before the once mighty Hindu Majapahit Empire was forced to relinquish control of Sumatra, and the people of the island began converting to Islam. From Sumatra, Islamic influence radiated outward to the surrounding islands of Java, Kalimantan, Sulawesi, Sultanate, the Moluccas and beyond, forever alternating the culture, religions and political history of the Nusantara archipelago. The Islamic conversion of Indonesia was not the result of a bloody holy war waged by zealots, but rather a slow organic process that began with centuries of commercial interactions between foreign Muslim merchants and local Austronesians. By the late 15th century, a point of no return had been crossed, and Nusantara would forever be a bastion of the Muslim faith. However, as Islam grew in strength and the Sultanate of Malacca reigned supreme, an existential threat loomed over the entire region. For halfway around the world, the armies of the Christendom had just driven the last Islamic kingdom in Spain into the sea and were now preparing to embark on the first of many overseas conquests. It would not be long before the European age of exploration arrived in Southeast Asia, and with it, the forces of global imperialism, which would leave both the land and the fate of Indonesia forever changed.